Chapter 19 of An American in the Making, The Life Story of an Immigrant by Marcus Eli Ravage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, The Fruits of Solitude. My expense account for 1906-07, which I still preserve along with some choice compositions, a notebook or two, and a gratifying press clipping about my maiden speech before the Cosmopolitan Club, as the precious mementos of that incredible year, ought not to be allowed to perish in the dark. It should certainly prove of inestimable value to certain extravagant-minded members of the Committee on Student Budgets by showing them what really are the possibilities of a minimum expenditure for young men in moderate circumstances. They would learn, for instance, that the item of amusements and incidentals is capable of an amazing contraction from $20 to very nearly nothing a year, or to be quite accurate, to $2.12. Thus, 2 half pecks of apples, 30 cents, 12 bananas, 12 cents, 1 football game, 50 cents, 1 basketball game, 25 cents, 2 visits to the Nickelodeon, 10 cents, smoking tobacco, 80 cents, 1 Christmas dinner cigar, 5 cents. What a person of more modest tastes than mine would do still further to bring this elastic item toward the absolute zero is an interesting question. It is clearly not indispensable to the maintenance of life to go to moving picture houses, and as long as the club table provides enough of bread and gravy, a consistently economical young man with a goal before him may conceivably eliminate such articles from his diet as bananas and apples. Still, I admit that I was extravagant at times. Let the next item speak for itself. Here are stamps, postal cards, and correspondence stationery to the appalling amount of $7.06. I hope no one will think me lacking in a sense of proportion, but the truth is that if I did not go oftener to the games and the shows, it was in order to have more money for letters. It was the only way for me to keep my soul alive. I wrote to everybody I knew because I loved everybody now who was in New York. Sometimes it was business, but the greater part of the time it was untainted affection. I had to remind Brother Harry several times how badly I needed those rubber shoes and socks he had promised me. Cousin Abby every now and then sent me a few of the radical papers, and I must express to him the genuine gratitude I felt for being kept in touch with the beloved world I had left behind. But the bulk of my correspondence was with Esther and 1 or 2 others of my erstwhile fellow students in the night school. It was to get their letters that I regularly raced home to my room between the 9 and the 10 o'clock classes, and whether I was bright or stupid the rest of the day depended largely on what the mails had brought me from them. Esther was generous as to length when she did write, but no amount of urging could convince her that a daily letter was not too much. Perhaps if she had known how much such things meant to me, she would have come around, but I did not want her to know. I was half unconsciously putting the best face on my life in Missouri. I wanted her to follow me. I wanted everybody at the Manhattan School to come to Missouri. Was it a selfish craving for the society of my own kind, or was it the peculiar psychology of the whipped dog longing for the sight of other whipped dogs? Perhaps I do not hesitate to confess that I had developed a kind of passion for wanting to see all my school friends in my own scrape, but I think I am honest when I add that I was merely hoping that it would do them as much good as it was doing me. And so, when Esther's resolution seemed to be on the breaking point, and she wrote me discouraged letters about the terrors of geometry and the heartlessness of examiners, I assumed the schoolmasterly tone and scolded her for her lack of persistence, and held out glowing pictures to her of the rewards that were awaiting her at the end of her struggles. And I was right, too, about Esther, at any rate. For the following autumn I had the satisfaction of seeing her in Missouri, where she still remains, as happy an American as ever came from Rumania. Of the 3 or 4 whom I succeeded in bringing out, she was the only one who stuck it out. The others maintained that they could see no fun in the thing. No, there was not much fun in being made into an American. I was painfully aware of that fact myself. Oh, the dreary loneliness of it, particularly the Sundays. Of all the days in the week, they were the hardest to live through. The very holiday tone in the air was suffocating me. Everybody else was busy and outrageously happy on Sunday. The boys in the house went to church in the morning, wrote letters in the afternoon, and went calling in the evening. I was left all alone. There was not even any mail. The library, the only place where I could still feel a sense of human contact, was closed. But there were whole seasons that, if anything, could surpass even those intolerable Sundays. At Christmas, nearly every fellow went home to his family. There was an exchange of presents and cheerful wishes. Invitations were extended to "good chaps" to come and partake of turkey and mashed potatoes at the homes of their friends. And then, for an entire fortnight, the town looked deserted, and I was almost the only boarder left at the club. I have an idea, for instance, that I was not particularly fond of the jams and the cakes and the fudge that a lot of the boys brought home with them from their week-end trips to the farm. If I recall aright, I had more than one taste of them, for those queer fellows were absurdly generous in their own surprising way. First, they would destroy my appetite for food by some thoughtless remark, and the next moment they would ask me to partake of their dainties with a "help yourself," which it was impossible to misunderstand. Ah, well, I had eaten better things in my day. And yet I envied them their "goodies." I often thought that it would be a jolly thing to have a mother on a farm somewhere, and to have her bake and boil things and pack them into one's suitcase while one went out to the barn and inquired about the health of the newest calf or the old rheumatic dog. And I sometimes even had an odd wish that I could be a "Christian." What did it matter after all that they took on faith so many unreasonable things, or said they did, and worshiped Jesus as a pale divinity while denying his fierce humanity, and coddled themselves into a belief in a second and much longer and rather emasculated existence? When one came right down to it, it was really immense for a religion, this Christianity, with its couples and its Easter bonnets, its socials and its watches, its clear-headed emphasis on the things of this world, its innocent, childlike hoydenism. If I had been born into any one of the many indistinguishable varieties of this faith, I often asked myself, would I have turned against it? Possibly not. but all the same, I did not often go to church. And, of course, I did not go calling at all. Missouri is a coeducational university, but it might just as well have been a monastery for all the social good it did me. When my ways and my personality were finding so little favor with the men, my chances of making friends with the women were, as you may well imagine, very scant indeed. Now and then, in the course of a recitation, I might get a whispered distress call from a young lady whose fate in the person of the professor had surprised in the midst of other thoughts. Occasionally, in the library too, such a one might, with a gracious smile, ask for assistance in the preparation of her English theme. But when she next saw me on the street or about the campus, she betrayed no sign of recognition. Even those who had formerly met me at the Deutscher Verein and had professed to be pleased to make my acquaintance seemed unaccountably eager to sever that acquaintance as soon as the meeting was over. Their conduct toward me was a painful mystery. It struck me, with my East Side notion of frankness, as needlessly insincere. Why, I wondered, don't they come out openly and tell me when I displease them? And I wanted very much to be friends with them. Their interests were much finer than the men's, and their appreciation of literature was keener. I would have given a great deal for the privilege of calling on one of a few girls I had observed in class, to take a walk with her and have a discussion in the good old style of East Broadway. Yes, it was dreary, but it was far from dull. I had but to take a glance into myself to find excitement aplenty. Solitude had its compensations, like everything else. For one thing, I was learning the valuable art of enjoying my own company. Back in the ghetto there had come a time once when it was a positive torment to remain alone. If there was not a gathering somewhere, if no one came to see me, I must at least run down into the teeming streets and mingle with the throngs and feel the pulse of people about me. If I could not see an intelligent, I might walk into a kazin and have a chat with a fellow Vasluiander. Here there was hardly any escape. The presence of the crowd was only a stimulant to my wistful thoughts. The gay laughter, the companionable groups, the beaming couples only made me feel lonelier than ever. In sheer self-defense, I tried for a time to delude myself with a consolation picture of the Missourian as a cold, unsympathetic dog. I pounced on his intense antisocial individualism, his worship of the strong man, his devotion to the ideal of personal success at all costs, his sneering indifference to the unspeakable miseries of the black man in his midst, his lack of interest in international matters, his snobbish disregard of the claims of the worker, and told myself that a fellow who walked about the world in that kind of thin shoes could hardly be expected to give much sentimental thought to the rather minor woes of a moping, hypersensitive individual who had chosen to thrust himself his way. It was a tremendous relief to think of him in this way, as a monstrous device of wood and steel, inasmuch as it did away with the need of further thinking and removed the unpleasant business of self-criticism. But the picture would not hold its color and kept gradually fading away before the light of facts. Willy-nilly, I must admit that there was an openness, a freedom, yes, even a delightful warmth and charm, a distinctive kind of pioneer neighborliness in the social atmosphere of Missouri, which was altogether unique in my experience. The very individualism of these people was in reality an emphasis on the happiness of the single life. They were far from unsympathetic among themselves and anything but cold even toward the complete stranger. When I spent a day at the infirmary, the whole crowd from the house and the table turned out to see me and poked fun at my gripe and, there was no escaping it, at myself. They made a religion of personal decency. No, it would not do. Unpalatable as the truth was, there was no evading the patent fact that if I was not taken in among the Missourians, the fault was with me and not with them. With this uncompromising confession came unexpected relief. I was floundering in the dark, as you see, grappling with my obstinate problem like a miner without tools and without a lantern. But having made up my mind that I was not a victim, but an unconscious comedian, it behooved me to stand before the glass and enjoy, if I might, my own amusing antics. Once I admitted that I really was material for sport, the logical thing was to try and see some of it myself. Perhaps to do something in the way of toning it down a bit. And so there followed a pitiless dissecting of the internal man, a dragging out into the light of a layer upon layer of encrusted self, a lining up for inspection of a whole vast procession of things, antiques from Syria, heirlooms from a long exile in Asia and Europe, shards and fragments of a proud and broken ancestry, warped bits of thin veneer from Rumania, heavy plate from the radical ghetto, gems and rubbish without end. I took in the exhibition with mingled feelings and asked myself incredulously whether all this was what I had been used to calling my simple self. The more I contemplated it, the more I felt inclined to be struck with the oddity of it. If that was what my American neighbors had in mind when they talked of taking the conceit out of me, they were coming very near to accomplishing their purpose. Another glance and I would be grinning at the pile myself. I was being threatened with a novel thing for an East Sider, a sense of humor. Quite as novel and as further result of my solitude was the opening of my eyes to the unsuspected miracles about me. Both in Rumania and in the ghetto, nature was looked upon either as vermin or vegetable, a thing to hold your nose at or to devour. As a child I had exhibited a fondness for animals, but when my father once found me playing with our neighbor's dog, he took me into the house and made it very clear to me how un-Hebraic my conduct had been. Such things, he told me earnestly, were of the Gentile, and a good child of our tribe should shun them. On the East Side, people did frequently take excursions to the neighboring parks, but the real attractions were oftener the lecture that went with the picnic and the stores of assorted food than the loveliness of the landscape. So here again was a ragged edge to my training. As the dreary months dragged on, I took to wandering out into the country. At first my chief aim was to run away from the house and my own unpleasant thoughts, but it was impossible to roam over the pretty hills around Columbia for very long without falling under their spell. I walked for the most part at night when my lessons for the next day were done, and I found myself becoming enchanted with its myriad mysteries, the fragrance of the damp earth, the rustle of the wind in the leaves, the murmur of the brooks, the scintillating fires of innumerable glowworms, the soothing feel of dew-filled cool grass, the sweep of clouds over the moon, the far-off voices of beasts and men, all these were filtering into my soul and making me into a new being. My enforced exclusiveness served also to advance me in my studies. My professor of English had probably never found out why I was so prompt with my papers when the majority of the class had to be urged and threatened and often penalized to make them bring theirs in on time. Well, what else was there for me to do when there were no girls to call up and no chums to come and drag me away to parties and things? Besides, I had for years looked forward to this opportunity when time and command of the language might adhere to make extensive reading possible. On the East Side, literature had consisted almost entirely of the insurgent moderns, interspersed with a few choice English writers like Carlyle, Shelley, and Shakespeare, whom we also regarded as "among our own." Now, with the aid of courses, I was coming upon whole continents of undiscovered books, and I threw myself with a navigator's zest into the joyous task of exploration. I was filling notebooks with exercises in style based on Stevenson and Hazlitt. I was coming back to my old enemy Milton and reveling in Paradise Lost, and I was devouring the great critics in order to obtain guidance for further voyages. Moreover, there was German literature, a planet in itself. A class reference had directed me to the 130-odd volume collection of the Deutsche National Literature, and I actually undertook to go through the whole thing from beginning to end. On the whole, then, it looked as if I might yet work out my salvation, if only those barbarians would leave me to myself. But it was not in them to do that. They seemed to be determined on disturbing my peace of mind. They were devoting, I honestly believe, all their spare thoughts and all their inventive genius to thinking up ways of making me uncomfortable. One young gentleman, still reminiscent of my ignorance of rural things, made up a tale of how I went to get a job on a farm and proceeded to relate it at the table. The farmer gave Max a pail and a stool and sent him out to milk the cow. About an hour later, when the old boy failed to show up with the stuff, Reuben went out to see what was the trouble. He found his new assistant in a fierce pickle. His clothes were torn and his hands and face were bleeding horribly. "What in heck is the matter?" asked the farmer. "Oh, curse the old cow," said Max. "I can't make her sit on that stool." A burst of merriment greeted the climactic ending, although the yarn was a trifle musty, and the most painful part of it was that I must laugh at the silly thing myself. It was not at all true, as one of my numerous roommates tried to intimate, that I shunned baths. I was merely conservative in the matter. One day, however, he had the indelicacy to ask me the somewhat personal question whether I ever took a bath, and I told him, of course rather sullenly, that I did once in a while. Some time later I overheard him repeat the dialogue to the other men in the house and provoking shouts of laughter. It puzzled me to see where the joke was, until I learned that these fellows were taking a shower bath at the gymnasium every day. It seemed to me that that was running a good thing into the ground. Again, I noticed that my roommates were making a great show of their toothbrushes. They used them after every meal and before retiring, as the advertisements say. and always with an unnecessary amount of splash and clatter. At home I had been taught to keep my mouth and teeth clean without all this fuss. Nevertheless, I thought that I would get a brush and join in the drill. After that, the other brushes became noticeably quiet. And then, of course, there was the institution of the practical joke. On April 1st there was soap in the pie. If you got in late to a meal, it was wise to brush your chair and pick your bites, if any bites were left. If not, there was no telling what you might swallow or sit on. More than once I tasted salt in my water and pepper in my biscuits. I seemed to have been marked from the first as a fit subject for these pranks. On Halloween, a squad of cadets commanded by a corporal entered my room and ordered me to get into my uniform, shoulder my gun, and proceed to the gymnasium, which, according to the order read, the commandant assigned me to guard against stragglers. I guarded through a whole uneventful night. Toward morning the captain of the football team, who had a room in the gymnasium, returned from a party. I ordered him to halt and give the password. He smiled and tried to enter. I made a lunge for him and would have run my bayonet through him if he had not begun to laugh. "Go on home, you poor boy," he said. "They pull that stunt off every year. Poor joke, I think." The next day my table mates tried to jolly me about it. They said I would be court-martialed as a deserter from duty. I got angry, and that made them all the more hilarious. Then a great strapping fellow named Harvey spoke up. "Be still, you galoots," he said to them. And then to me, "For gosh sake, fellow, be human." I tried a long time to figure out what he meant by human, and for the rest of my college career I strove hard to follow his advice. It was the first real hint I had got on what America, through her representatives in Missouri, was expecting of me. Harvey became my first American friend. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of An American in the Making, The Life Story of an Immigrant by Marcus Eli Ravage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, Harvey. I was still at the stage where one American looked and acted exactly as every other, and it was a profound mystery to me how I had gained the favor of this very representative specimen of the type. I had not greatly changed, as far as I could judge, between September and February, unless it was for the worse. If I had only had one or two of my own people and had not been in such dire need of human fellowship, I doubt whether I should have been attracted to him, notwithstanding the fact that I owed him a debt of gratitude for having taken up the cudgels in my behalf. But he was a long way from being hard up for company. I walked home with him from the club that night, and I observed, with a feeling mingled of envy and admiration, that he was cordially greeted by almost every one that passed us, and during the half hour that I remained in his room he must have had a dozen friends dropping in, who were as amazed to find him hobnobbing with me as I was myself. My surprise at his unaccountable behavior toward me reached a climax when, a few days later, he asked me to come and live with him. "Captain," he said, "you and I are pretty much in the same boat. If you want an old lady, let's get together." I could scarcely believe my ears. What could he be up to? I wondered as soon as my first flush of joy at his offer had passed. Some new variety of practical joke that I had not yet experienced? Or was it really possible that I was, quotes, arriving in Missouri? Be his scheme what it might, I felt a great temptation to accept, but remembering my long record of failures as a roommate, I hesitated, lest my new found friendship, if it was friendship, should go on the rocks. I should like to, I said, but I think I had better not. Then Harvey told me some things about himself that opened my eyes and reassured me. I had thought that I was the only one at Missouri who did not know where his next week's board was coming from, and that everyone else belonged, as they had warned me in the ghetto, among the capitalists. But this fellow, who was in his own country, it turned out, was, if anything, poorer than I. He too had come to college from the ranks of the worker. He was toiling nights and vacations and paying 10% compound interest on periodic borrowings to get an education which he, like myself, had been struggling for years to attain. That was what he had in mind when he said that we were in the same boat. In addition, we had various and sundry interests in common. As far as my observation could determine, he was the only freshman I had run into who cared anything about reading as a recreation. He was intending ultimately to go into engineering, but he was taking courses in the languages, a rare procedure in Missouri. Cultural value, a phrase I had not often heard in the past 5 months, kept continually reoccurring in his remarks about studies. And, best of all, he confessed to a weakness for argument about religion and other matters, which was as convincing as it was irresistible. From the first, our relations were those between master and disciple. Much as I had longed all these weary months for someone who could understand me, it was not Harvey's intellectual and liberal leanings that I prized in him most. In September it might have been different, but now I had definitely settled down to the role of a captive in a foreign land. I had almost learned to endure the personal inconveniences of my situation, and I was determined that I must bring away something in the nature of a system of Missouri philosophy for the edification of the people at home when the time came and I regained my liberty. Harvey was the man to help me compass this purpose. For all his unexpected divergencies from the rank and file, I could not help regarding him as a kind of epitome of the national character. He knew the speech and the customs, the heart and the soul of the native. Between him and his friends I should have no difficulty in piecing out a life-size portrait of the creature. The differences began to crop up between us right away. Out of the countless discussions with which we beguiled the Sunday evenings — Harvey did not go calling — one inescapable conclusion emerged, that whatever was sacred to me was anathema to him, and that everything that he accepted as unquestioned truth was, to say the best for it, a string of dubious commonplaces to me. He had, for instance, worked all his adult life with his hands, but he distrusted the organizations and the hopes of the laboring man. He was a churchman, and he looked now to the parson and then to the successful business man to regenerate the earth, if indeed this perfect earth needed regenerating. There was something positively religious in his worship of success in the abstract. Given success, he seemed to feel, and all the other virtues in the book must follow as a matter of course. The man who had risen to the top could not but be good and clean and sane and self-controlled and clear-sighted as to the true values of life. He was not only the strong man, but the benefactor of the race as well. In some mysterious manner he was fulfilling the divine purpose while pursuing his own interests. The reason why America was great was because she had the wisdom to give free rein to the ambitions of the individual. The country had been made by its big men. To me, all this was not only far-fetched, it was contradictory from Harvey's own point of view. For my good friend's conduct belied his philosophy, and what is more, in his better moments, he openly professed devotion to a set of principles which were the direct opposite of the 39 Articles of Success. These, I thought, he lived up to with a rigidity born of natural instinct and conviction. He abhorred immodesty, self-advertising, aggressiveness, show, the cold insistence on literal justness. In short, the major qualities by which commercial success is made possible. I was constantly learning from him the excellent habit of giving in when I was right, of declining the things that were my due, of minimizing instead of exaggerating my own virtues and little superiorities. When Harvey got some new clothes and I praised them, he blushed, the burly giant, and waved me aside with a deprecating hand. If I said of a theme of his, "That is a neat piece of work, Colonel," he said, "Get out, you don't call that English." Once we bought a peck of apples in partnership for 35 cents. I hesitated a moment whether to give him 17 or 18 cents as my share of the outlay, and then generously decided to make it 18. Harvey tossed the pennies back and said, "We'll call it square, old gaspipe." When I suggested dividing up the fruit, he gave me a queer glance and then took a few handfuls and left me nearly 2/3 of the peck. I had thought he would count them and pick out the biggest ones. I was using his shoe-blacking, and my East Side sense of strict dealing told me that I ought to pay for it. But when I offered Harvey a nickel, he refused it, and when I insisted on his taking it, he simply told me that I might buy the next can. The idea had never occurred to me. But he was not consistent even in his magnanimity. There seemed to be a shadow line somewhere in his system where self-denial ended and self-assertion began, or, as he expressed it once, where a fellow must stop giving in because the other side was doing the taking in. I do not know whether he still remembers, but I certainly have not forgotten the incident of the fountain pen. I must say that it was not I who asked Harvey to let me use it, but he must have observed that I had none and that I was having a struggle with an old-fashioned wooden penholder I had brought from New York, and so one night he suggested that I might see what I could do with his fountain pen. "May I?" I asked. "Sure, go ahead. Help yourself any time," he said. I used it 3 or 4 times, and then I noticed that the thing had disappeared from the table. Why? Clearly I had abused the privilege. But he had said any time, hadn't he? Now in the ghetto no one would have granted any such unlimited rights to private property. But once one had committed himself, he would have stuck it out to the end. In Missouri the rule seemed to be that you can have anything as long as you don't ask for it, and that as soon as you have accepted a liberal offer too literally, you have really forfeited your privileges. Not more than 3 days after this subtle lesson, I engaged a laundress to call for my clothes. By the time she appeared for my first batch, I had come upon another woman who charged more reasonably, and had given the work to her. Harvey was in the room when the original woman showed up, and I could see that he was listening with disapproval to what I was telling her. As soon as she was gone, he opened fire on me. "Confound you," he said. "Why did you do that?" "Well," I answered, "I changed my mind. Haven't I a right to do that?" "Yes," he retorted, "but you could have let her know." I was about to answer him that he might practice what he preached, but it occurred to me that perhaps the American logic made a distinction between roommates and laundresses, and between fountain pens and soiled linen, and I said nothing. My confusion was increasing from day to day, and largely because Harvey and his friends worshiped simultaneously at two distinct and opposed shrines. Harvey had a discerning ear for music and played the fiddle with considerable skill. I envied him the accomplishment, both because it enabled him to earn money more easily than I did, and because he got no end of fun out of it. And yet it was a curious thing that my friend was, I do not know what else to call it, ashamed of his talent. When we were alone, he fondled his instrument as a loving mother fondles a child, and played everything, from college songs to nocturnes, and studied little booklets on the art of bowing and what not. But as soon as his Missouri friends came in to see him, he either put the beloved thing into its case and hid it in the closet, or if he was caught red-handed, he took on a sheepish air and spoke condescendingly of it as a frivolous diversion, and struck up "Turkey in the Straw" or the Arkansas Traveler. Why? I made bold to ask him once, and his answer was more absurd than his conduct. He said, "It is thought a bit effeminate for a man to care for music." I could not forbear a glance at him as he said it, and the incongruity of this 6-footer with his huge hands and powerful frame worrying his head lest he should not be thought masculine enough made me laugh in his face. But Harvey knew his people better than I did. That wholesome manliness which I had so sincerely admired on arriving at Columbia had a worm at its root. It was the fashion, you see, to be masculine in Missouri. And when a thing becomes fashionable, it ceases to be genuine. Those whom nature had endowed with the virtue made a fetish and a self-conscious pose of it, and those who lacked it became obsessed with the desire to imitate it. The final insult to a Missourian was to suggest that he was sissified. There was something like a panic among the more refined of my fellow students at the mere mention of effeminacy. Even the girls dreaded it. They too affected a kind of factitious burliness, a worship of the strident male, a hail fellow well met air. They liked to greet one another with the jolly halloo and the slap on the back, and betrayed an odd fondness for the big sweater and the heavy boot, and the words fellow and bully. The mania was having its effect on the course of study and the whole life of the university. The departments of the arts were thrown on the defensive. The professor must adopt an apologetic tone for being interested in such unmanly things as poetry, music, or painting. Sentiment being tabooed as effeminate, it followed inevitably that whatever in the curriculum addressed itself to the emotions must be avoided like a plague. In speaking of his friends, Harvey constantly alluded to broads and narrows. There was Lowry, who never failed to remind us that the particular sect to which he belonged was the only true Christian body, because its bishops had been the recipients of the apostolic touch from the beginning of the world. Lowry was narrow, it appeared. On the other hand, Higgins and Moore were broad, and Harvey advised me to cultivate their acquaintance. I tackled first one and then the other, and found that they were not adverse to discussion even about religion. But as soon as I betrayed myself by questioning the validity of the more fundamental doctrines of theology, they informed me that certain things had better not be touched. Broadness seemed to consist in being tolerant towards Presbyterians if you were a Methodist, or toward Baptists if you were a Congregationalist. Some of those boys, on the other hand, presented a problem of another kind that baffled me for a long time. When I solved it, I had taken one more step towards becoming an American. It was true that I mowed lawns and washed dishes and waited on tables and did a score of other odd jobs to make ends meet. But then I was an immigrant without parents and without resources. If I had the means, I thought, I would rather not engage in all these extramural activities and devote all my time to study and recreation. But among the other dishwashers at the club, I learned there were young men whose fathers had large farms or big businesses in the little towns. Why, I wondered, did they not support their sons through college decently? Then I made the interesting discovery that they did not want to be supported, that not to be supported was their idea of going through college decently. I revolved that idea through my head until I got it. It showed me the Missourian in a new light. I could almost forgive him his indifference to radical discussions. If I was by degrees being turned into an American, my friend and roommate was learning a few things about the ghetto and finding them not half so repulsive as he had thought. On several occasions Harvey listened with interest to excerpts from Yiddish literature, which I translated for him from periodicals and pamphlets I had brought with me. Now and then my brother Paul sent me a few choice morsels from home, Rumanian pastrami, or cheese, or ripe olives, and it was gratifying to observe that Harvey smacked his lips after sampling them. Toward the end of the winter we had definitely formed the habit of having midnight spreads, which never came at midnight, because Harvey was subject to a peculiar failing of getting hungry by 9 o'clock, which he justified by declaring that it required more fuel to run a big engine than a small one. I also taught him to drink tea made and served in the Russian way. Harvey supplied the alcohol burner and the pot, and I furnished the tea, and every night, just when I thought he was in the thick of his mathematics or German, he would suddenly look up and give me a significant wink. Then I would look blank, and he would smile encouragingly and enlighten me further by the monosyllable "feast." If I still failed to rise to his enthusiasm, he would say, "Shall we?" And before I could answer, he would make a dash for the corner of the room called the kitchen and spread a newspaper at one end of the table and announce in a falsetto voice that supper was served. On Saturday afternoons, if there was no play in town that week and Harvey did not have to go to orchestra rehearsals, we would go out on the back lot with a ball and a glove, and I would revive an art I had not practiced since childhood. But the ball was much harder than the kind I had known in Vaslui, and my hands would get black and blue after an hour's catching, and Harvey would laugh every time I let a hot one pass without making an effort to stop it, and tell me that the essential thing in becoming an American was to get toughened up. When the baseball season opened, he took me with him to one of the games and explained its mysteries to me, and spoke enthusiastically of its science and said that it was the only real national sport, at which I had to smile because it was the very game we used to play at home, only we called it oina, with a ball made of rags and pieces of board torn out of fences for bats. And as I looked around me and saw dignified professors and rheumy-eyed Civil War veterans tossing their hats in the air, I wished that my father could be present so that I might convince him of the profound truth I had failed as a boy to get through his head, that an oina was a joy forever and not the silly, childish thing that he insisted it was. Gradually, too, Harvey was getting acquainted with my past history and, much to my amazement, approving of it. Once, when I begged him not to let the details of my career go any further, he looked at me in astonishment and called me a fool. "You deserve all the credit in the world, you bloomin' idiot," he added. Evidently he regarded my sweatshop experiences in the light of heroic deeds. And thereafter he made it a point to let every one of his friends know just the kind of marvel his queer roommate was, and they also, narrows and broads alike, appeared to think the better of me for my humble past, and to show more cordiality toward me when they passed me on the street. Odd, isn't it? I kept thinking. Intellectually, I would probably have felt more at home in a European university. But supposing even that anyone could have leaped from the sweatshop to college over there, would his fellow students have forgiven him his origin, to say nothing of praising him for it? What Harvey could not forgive me, and what came very near to wrecking our friendship, was what he termed my contemptible habit of smoking cigarettes. At first I thought that the odor of tobacco was offensive to him, and put myself to the inconvenience of going out of the house whenever I felt the desire for a smoke. But my pains seemed to go for naught. Our relations remained as strained as ever. "What is the objection?" I finally asked him. "Oh, nothing," he answered, "if you can't see for yourself how picayune and insignificant the pesky things make you look." More masculinity, I reflected, and asked someone in New York to send me a pipe, adding that cigarettes were not in fashion in Missouri. Then I found that I had hit upon another snag in the American character, for Harvey apparently relished my pipe even less than he did the cigarettes. Surely, I asked myself, a pipe was not effeminate. No, indeed. But the whole business of smoking revealed a deplorable moral degeneracy. It was one of the habits that break as opposed to the habits that make, as one of those curious composite doctor preachers who kept constantly resorting to the university and talking to men only neatly expressed it. Not masculinity, then, but success. My experiences with Harvey and with Americans generally have bred in me the conviction that no one should be granted citizen's papers until he can see a joke. A man has not even begun the process of readjustment as long as he still stares blankly at the sallies of native humor. And it goes without saying that the simplest as well as the most conclusive test as to whether a foreigner has acquired anything like a respectable command of English lies along the line of the story. You may read and enjoy Shakespeare or Emerson. You may write a first-rate business letter in English. You may be enrolled Republican or Democrat. But all this avails you nothing, and in your heart of hearts you are a hopeless alien. Even an interest in outdoor sports is no convincing proof that you are naturalized. It may be faked. Do you go wild over Bill Nye's History of the United States? Do you laugh till the tears run down your face at Mark Twain's description of a Turkish bath? Do you turn to the last column on the editorial page of the evening paper and devour that before you even think of the sporting page, let alone the news? Above all, can you do your share at the dinner table or at the marshmallow party when conversation becomes feeble and someone proposes stories? Then you are an American to the bone. I don't care how much you may believe in the divine right of kings and in secret diplomacy. In America, or at least in Missouri, everyone is a wit, or tries to be. No one says simply, "Pass me the salt." What he says is, "May I crave the saline or the NaCl?" Just as no one asks you where you live, but where is your habitat or domicile? An American will not talk or write a personal letter unless he can be funny. It is an excellent national trait. It makes conversation breezy. But I think it often makes it scarce. I owe it to Harvey, who did not have to try to be a wag, that I made this jolly American characteristic, among many others, in part my own. Indeed, any inventory of my first year at college will reveal an astonishing list of things over and above what I had started out to get. The university catalog omits quite as much as it includes. It makes absolutely no mention of the unofficial extension courses under Professor Harvey, of the practical joke as an educational method, and of the special department of personal relations for the benefit of foreign students. The peasant in Rumania says very truly that one never knows what kind of bargain he is going to make until he gets to market. I had gone to Missouri to become a doctor, but Joe Shapiro was a real prophet. Those capitalists and oppressors were making me into a gentleman. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of An American in the Making, The Life Story of an Immigrant by Marcus Eli Ravage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, The Romance of Readjustment. As the summer drew near, I began to look around for something to do. I would spend nearly $125, I saw, between September and June, and half of it borrowed money. Harry, from whom I had got almost no help the first year, had just married and gone into business for himself, and he was giving me to understand in very broad hints that I need not rely on him the next year. Brother Paul had been out of work for the better part of the winter and was trying desperately to keep alive while paying off some of the debts he had made in his period of unemployment. My friend, who had more than lived up to his promises, had, to be sure, agreed to lend me $50 every year, but I was endeavoring to bring him out to Missouri, and if I succeeded, he would need all he had to pay his own way. Therefore, if I meant to return to school next year, I must find a way to earn enough to give me at least a good start in the fall. I discussed the question with Harvey, and he made several suggestions. He himself was going to Joplin, where there was a lot of building, and where he, being a carpenter, always found plenty to do. I might come along with him and try my luck in the zinc mines. Or there were the Kansas wheat fields, where they paid $2.50 a day and keep. A number of students were going there summer after summer and returning with their hides well tanned and their pockets well lined. Still, on second thought, he would not advise me to tackle harvesting. I might not be able to stand it, with my soft hands and my town breeding. But I gave very little thought to his advice. I was longing for a sight of New York. It would cost $50 to go there and back, but I tried to persuade myself that I would earn enough more in the city to make it worth while. If the worst came to the worst, I could always get a job at the machine. I was known there. I had friends and old pupils. Tutoring was a possibility, particularly with my added prestige as a college man. There was no limit to the things that one could do in a large town. And deep down in my foolish heart I knew quite well that all these calculations were but a sham. In the letter I wrote to Esther, I honestly confessed that if I remained away from my own people that summer, I would feel like a man who was forced to work 7 days in the week and would be unfit to resume work in the fall. Then Paul somehow divined my thoughts and surprised me one fine June morning with a money order for $30 and a letter saying that he would not forgive me if I did not come and spend the vacations at home. Heaven alone knows where he got it, but there it was. And I sent him back a postcard with the picture of a saddled donkey and the words "Ready to pack" underneath. The examinations had just been held, and I delayed only a few days until the instructors returned my notebooks and told me my marks. Harvey was hanging over till after commencement because the closing days of the session were crowded with dances and entertainments, and he was cleaning up a lot of money with the orchestra. He had an amused twinkle in his eye as he watched me excitedly getting ready, and every now and then he would ask, "Well, old fish, do you think we'll see you back with us next year? Or do you think you've had enough of the wild and woolly West?" And when I told him with great emphasis that nothing in the world would keep me away from Missouri until I had finished the course, he slapped me on the back and cried, "Now you're talking. We'll make a man of you yet." Then he would add, "But say, if those anarchists get a hold of you and keep you there, let a fellow know what's happening to you. Maybe we can come to the rescue." So to New York I went and lived through the last and the bitterest episode in the Romance of Readjustment. During that whole strenuous year, while I was fighting my battle for America, I had never for a moment stopped to figure the price it was costing me. I had not dreamed that my mere going to Missouri had opened up a gulf between me and the world I had come from, and that every step I was taking toward my ultimate goal was a stride away from everything that had once been mine, that had once been myself. Now, no sooner had I alighted from the train than it came upon me with a pang that 1 year out there had loosened ties that I had imagined were eternal. There was Paul faithfully at the ferry, and as I came off he rushed up to me and threw his arms around me and kissed me affectionately. Did I kiss him back? I am afraid not. He took the grip out of my hand and carried it to the Brooklyn Bridge. Then we boarded a car. I asked him where we were going, and he said mysteriously, "To Harry's." A surprise was awaiting me, apparently. As we entered the little alley of a store in the Italian quarter, I looked about me and saw no one. But suddenly there was a burst of laughter from a dozen voices, a door or two opened violently, and my whole family was upon me: brothers, a new sister-in-law, cousins of various degrees, some old people, a few children. They rushed me into the apartment behind the store, pelting me with endearments and with questions. The table was set as for a Purim feast. There was an odor of pot-roasted chicken, and my eye caught a glimpse of chopped eggplant. As the meal progressed, my heart was touched by their loving thoughtfulness. Nothing had been omitted, not even the red wine and the Turkish peas and rice. Harry and everyone else kept on urging me to eat. "It's a long time since you have had a real meal," said my sister-in-law. How true it was, but I felt constrained and ate very little. Here were the people and the things I had so longed to be with, but I caught myself regarding them with the eyes of a Western American. Suddenly, at a glance as it were, I grasped the answer to the problem that had puzzled me so long, for here in the persons of those dear to me I was seeing myself as those others had seen me. I went about revisiting old scenes and found that everything had changed in my brief absence. My friends were not the same. The East Side was not the same. They never would be the same. What had come over them? My kinsfolk and my old companions looked me over and declared that it was I who had become transformed. I had become soberer. I carried myself differently. There was an unfamiliar reserve, something mingled of coldness and melancholy in my eye. My very speech had a new intonation. It was more incisive, but less fluent, less cordial, they thought. Perhaps so. At any rate, while my people were still dear to me, and always would be dear to me, the atmosphere about them repelled me. If it was I who had changed, then as I took in the little world I had emerged from, I could not help telling myself that the change was a salutary one. While calling at the old basement bookshop on East Broadway, I suddenly heard a horrible wailing and lamenting on the street. A funeral procession was hurrying by, followed by several women in an open carriage. Their hair was flying, their faces were red with weeping, their bodies were swaying grotesquely on the rhythm of their violent cries. The oldest in the group continued mechanically to address the body in the hearse. "Husband dear, upon whom have you left us? Upon whom, husband dear?" A young girl facing her in the vehicle looked about in a terrified manner, seized every now and then the hand of her afflicted mother, and tried to quiet her. The frightful scene, with its tragic display, its abysmal ludicrousness, its barbarous noise, revolted me. I had seen the like of it before, but that was in another life. I had once been part of such a performance myself, and the grief of it still lingered somewhere in my motley soul. But now I could only think of the affecting simplicity, the quiet, unobtrusive solemnity of a burial I had witnessed the previous spring in the West. The afternoon following my arrival I flew uptown to see Esther. She waved to me and smiled as I approached. She had been waiting on the stoop. As she shook my hand in her somewhat masculine fashion, she took me in with a glance, and the first thing she said was, "What a genteel person you have become. You have changed astonishingly." "Do you think so?" I asked her. "I am afraid I haven't. At least they do not think so in Missouri." Then she told me that she had got only 10 points, but that she was expecting 3 more in the fall. She was almost resigned to wait another year before entering college. That would enable her to make her total requirements, save up a little more money, and get her breath. "A woman is not a man, you know," she added. "I am beginning to feel the effects of it all. I am really exhausted. Geometry has nearly finished me, and mother has added her share. She is no longer young, and this winter she was ill. I have worried, and I have had to send money. But let us not talk about my troubles. You are full of things to tell me, I know." Yes, I had lots I wanted to say, but I did not know where to begin, and the other thing that was uppermost in my mind I was afraid to utter, lest she should misunderstand and feel injured and reproach me. I did not want her to reproach me on first meeting. I wanted to give myself time as well as her. And so we fell into one of those customary long silences, and for a while I felt at home again, and reflected that perhaps I had been hasty in letting the first poignant reactions mislead me. Toward evening Esther remarked that it was fortunate I had got to town the day before. If I had no other plans, she would take me to a meeting at Clinton Hall, where Michailoff was to speak on "The Coming Storm in America." It would be exciting, she said, and enlightening. Michailoff had just come out of prison. He was full of new impressions of America and the "system" generally, and one could rely on him to tear things open. Of course we went, and the assemblage was noisy and quarrelsome and intolerant, and the hall was stuffy and smelly, and the speaker was honest and fiery and ill-informed. He thundered passionately, and as if he were detailing a personal grievance against American individualism and the benighted Americans who allowed a medieval religion and an oppressive capitalistic system to mulct and exploit them, and referred to a recent article in the Zukunft where the writer had weakly admitted the need of being fair even to Christianity, and insisted that to be fair to an enemy of humanity was to be a traitor to humanity. I listened to it all with an alien ear. Soon I caught myself defending the enemy out there. What did these folk know of Americans anyhow? Michailoff was, after all, to radicalism what Higgins and Moore were to Christianity. His idea of being liberal was to tolerate anarchism if you were a socialist, and communism if you were an individualist. And as I left the hall, I told Esther what I had hesitated to tell her earlier in the evening. Save yourself, my dear friend. Run as fast as you can. You will find a bigger and a freer world than this. Promise me that you will follow me to the West this fall. You will thank me for it. Those big, genuine people out in Missouri are the salt of the earth. Whatever they may think about the problem of universal brotherhood, they have already solved it for their next-door neighbors. There is no need of the social revolution in Missouri. They have a generous slice of the kingdom of heaven. Maybe I was exaggerating, but that was how I felt. From this distance and from these surroundings, Missouri and the new world she meant to me was enchanting and heroic. The loneliness I had endured, the snubbing, the ridicule, the inner struggles, all the dreariness and the sadness of my life in exile had faded out of the picture, and what remained was only an idealized vision of the clean manhood, the large human dignity, the wholesome, bracing atmosphere of it, which contrasted so strikingly with the things around me. No, there was no sense in deceiving myself. The East Side had somehow ceased to be my world. I had thought a few days ago that I was going home. I had yelled to Harvey from the train as it was pulling out of the station at Columbia, "I am going home, old man." But I had merely come to another strange land. In the fall I would return to that other exile. I was indeed a man without a country. During that entire summer, while I opened gates on an elevated train in Brooklyn, I tussled with my problem. It was quite apparent to me from the first what its solution must be. I knew that now there was no going back for me, that my only hope lay in continuing in the direction I had taken, however painful it may be to my loved ones and to myself. but for a long time I could not admit it to myself. A host of voices and sights and memories had awakened within me that clutched me to my people and to my past. As long as I remained in New York, I kept up the tragic farce of making Sunday calls on brother Harry and pretending that all was as before, that America and education had changed nothing, that I was still one of them. I had taken a room in a remote quarter of Brooklyn where there were few immigrants, under the pretense that it was nearer to the railway barns. But I was deceiving no one but myself. Most of my relatives, who had received me so heartily when I arrived, seemed to be avoiding Harry's house on Sundays, and on those rare occasions when I ran into one of them, he seemed frigid and ill at ease. Once Paul said to me, "You are very funny. It looks as if you were ashamed of the family. You aren't really, are you? You know they said you would be when you went away. There is a lot of foolish talk about it. Everybody speaks of Harry and me as the doctor's brothers. Can't you warm up?" I poured out my heart in a letter to Harvey. If a year ago I had been told that I would be laying my sorrows and my disappointments in my own kindred before anyone out there, I would have laughed at the idea. But that barbarian in Missouri was the only human being, strangely enough, in whom I could now confide with any hope of being understood. I tried to convey to him some idea of the agonizing moral experience I was going through. I told him that I was aching to get back to Columbia, how apt the name was, to take up again where I had left off the process of my transformation, and to get through with it as soon as might be. And in the fall I went back, this time a week before college opened, and was met by Harvey at the station, just as those rural-looking boys had been met by their friends the year before. When I reached the campus, I was surprised to see how many people knew me. Scores of them came up and slapped me on the back and shook hands in their hearty, boisterous fashion, and hoped that I had had a jolly summer. I was asked to join boarding clubs, to become a member in debating societies, to come and see this fellow or that in his room. It took me off my feet, this sudden geniality of my fellows toward me. I had not been aware how, throughout the previous year, the barriers between us had been gradually and steadily breaking down. It came upon me all at once. I felt my heart going out to my new friends. I had become one of them. I was not a man without a country. I was an American. The end. End of chapter 21. End of An American in the Making, The Life Story of an Immigrant by Marcus Eli Ravage. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.